Welcome back to Benjamins with Ben. In this video, we're going to dive into a topic that affects most of us, the cost of living. As we talk about cost of living, we're quickly going to define what cost of living is. So cost of living is basically any fixed expenses that you might have. So this is stuff you know you're going to have to pay on a month-to-month basis. That's things like rent, mortgage, utilities, and food. Anything that falls into that bucket. Let's kick things off by addressing the elephant in the room. How much are people spending on rent and utilities relative to their incomes? There's some general benchmarks in the world of personal finance, and it's said that people ought to be spending no more than 30% of their gross income on cost of living. In my experience, this has been doable, but not without earning a fair amount of money. If you live in a metropolitan area, earnings become particularly important as cost of living can be quite high, especially if you're young. Out of college, I was spending about $1,400 a month on rent and utilities, while I was earning about $5,600 a month. That means, if we do the math real quick, it comes out to about 24% of my take-home pay. By the time I left that living situation, my cost of living had dropped to about 20% of my income because my income continued to grow and that rent just stayed the same. This left room for saving, investing, eating out occasionally, and even going on a really cool vacation. If I were to guess, should cost of living exceed 30% my gross income, then I would need to start cutting on things like eating out, finding ways to save on groceries, traveling less in order to continue to save and invest. I'm going to throw an equation up on the screen so you can do the math, and it's going to help you figure out if you're spending more than 30% of your income on cost of living. If you are, it may be time to start making some changes. Maybe you can find another living situation, eat out a little bit less, or just change what and where you eat. As far as housing options go, there are a few things you can do. You can rent a room in a house with roommates. This helps lower the cost of living because the rent is typically fairly static. The more roommates you have, typically the lower rent is. Think something like a fraternity or sorority might have lower individual rent. If you want to live alone, then you can try and find a studio or a small one-bedroom apartment in an older building. If you have a good relationship with your parents, then it's also worth considering moving back in with them. Same thing if you maybe have a good relationship with an aunt or uncle or grandparents. This can really help in terms of getting that cost of living down. Even if you are paying rent to those people, family will typically charge you less than a landlord would. This is especially true if you're under 30, as it's generally seen as more socially acceptable to be living at home. As we can see, now 50% of people under 30 are living with their families. As far as budgeting goes, there are many good options for budgeting tools. My previous favorite was Mint, which is owned by Intuit. Unfortunately, Intuit shut down Mint at the beginning of this year, 2024, and migrated everyone over to Credit Karma. Unfortunately, Credit Karma is not nearly as good as Mint at helping you track spending and set budgets. There are a couple alternatives you can look at. One is YNAB, You Need a Budget. It's a good paid option. If you still want to go for a free budgeting option, then you can try something like Rocket Money, which is what I'm going to try. We are going to go ahead and do a quick overview of how to budget. The first thing that you need to do is set some sort of financial goal. So this could be identifying a short-term or a long-term financial goal. It could be something like buying a house, could be something like buying a car, could be something like hitting a certain goal within investment accounts. Next, you're going to want to prioritize your goals based off importance and urgency. So something that's really important might be saving for a house, for a place to live. How urgent is that? Maybe not super urgent, because renting in most places right now is much less expensive than buying. It would take quite a while for buying a house to make more sense than renting at current interest rates. Of course, you could always buy a house with the plan of refinancing later on, but understand that there's some risk there. Once you set your financial goals, as part of budgeting, you should list all your sources of income. This includes salary, freelance work, investments, etc. From here, you're going to determine your total monthly or annual income. Ideally, you do annual, and then you break it down to monthly, so you know how much you're making on an annual basis and on a monthly basis. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to list your expenses. So you're going to categorize your expenses into fixed or consistent expenses and variable or fluctuating expenses. Example of a fixed expense would be something like rent, paying off a mortgage payment, utilities, groceries, transportation, and then something that might be more variable, things like entertainment and dining out. From here, you've got your foundation. So you know what you're making, you know roughly what you're spending from a fixed expense category and a variable expense category. Now, you're going to want to track your spending over time. So to start, just monitor your spending for about a month and identify some patterns and some areas where you might want to cut back. The first thing that I realized when I was creating my very first budget in college was that I was spending over $100 a month on Starbucks. I did not feel like I actually needed to be spending over $100 a month on Starbucks. I was spending something like $1,300 a year, and that's now $1,300 that I save and invest. That doesn't mean I don't buy Starbucks at all. I just buy it a lot less often, and it feels like more of a reward or more of a treat when I get it. Once you've identified some areas where you can cut back and some more regular spend in different categories, you can allocate specific amounts to different expense categories based on your income and your priorities. Generally, in the world of personal finance, people say that you should have some sort of emergency fund. This is generally going to be 6 to 12 months of fixed living expenses. So you think about what can you cut out of your current day-to-day spending so that you're just paying to live if you absolutely needed to. And this may include some other spending, some discretionary spending as well. Just make sure that you budgeted for it when you're figuring out how much you think you would spend over 6 to 12 months if something happened like a layoff. Once you figure out an amount, allocate a portion of your budget to help fund that emergency fund so you can cover unexpected expenses. The next thing we want to look at is how much we're putting into savings and investments. As a general rule of thumb, somewhere around 20% of our incomes should be going to saving and investing. If applicable, we can also include a category in our budget for repaying things like student debt or debt on a car. Generally, we want to try and prioritize high interest debts because that is what can really work against us over time. However, if you subscribe to what Dave Ramsey says, then you should just pay off whatever the smallest amount of debt you have is first, so you can get momentum and then continue to pay off debt. His approach is more of a psychological approach as opposed to a logical approach, but depends on the person. Logical approach to pay off something that is high interest first may make sense for a lot of people, but for others, we may want to pay off what we can pay off because it feels better. Should then periodically review your budget. I usually look at mine somewhere around once a month, and this is just to ensure that I'm staying on track, or if I went over in one category, to make sure that I can be under in the next month and taper back that spending. You can then adjust allocations to different categories based on changes in incomes, changes in expenses, and or financial goals. Using budgeting tools can be super helpful. Using apps like You Need a Budget or something like Rocket Money can help a lot in automating tracking and helping to stay organized. The other thing we should do is plan for irregular expenses. This can be something like the battery dies in your car. You need to get it replaced. It's a couple $100. Or maybe your dog eats a bunch of chocolate and you need to go to the vet. Also be sure to anticipate irregular expenses like annual subscriptions. I know I've been surprised to buy Amazon billing me $160 for a Prime membership, and I'm like, what? I didn't buy anything on Prime. And then I realized that it's just my Prime membership being billed at an annual rate. Also be sure to account for things like holiday spending or maintenance costs that are recurrent. Something like an oil change happens every 6 to 12 months, depending on how much you drive. And that can be about $120, but generally something that can be planned for. Once you've got your initial budget in place, you can then regularly monitor and make adjustments. For example, I spent a lot on gas last month, so I'm going to try and drive less this month. I spent a lot on eating out last month, so I'm going to try and spend less on eating out, maybe learn how to make some new recipes at home. In this video, we learned a couple of things. How much to spend on housing relative to income, exploring different options for cutting costs and the importance of effective budgeting, as well as some different budgeting tools that you could try out when approaching your budget. If you found any of this at all valuable, please subscribe so you don't miss a video. Have a good one, y'all.